And there's something else I'd like to add, because you were saying, well, where could it possibly be? I'll give you a for instance. And this may be tough to grasp, but let me try. The Great Depression, as you can imagine, asset values shrank. So we had a balance sheet problem then too. We had recovery. But by the end of the 30s, residential construction and auto sales were still not where they had been at the end of the 20s. Interesting. You remember we were looking at housing starts, and housing starts were now down to 500,000? Remember? In 1926, housing starts were 1 million. 1926. So, I mean, okay. So the Roaring 20s were the Roaring 20s. 1926. Think of how many people we had. Now, at the end of the 30s, we were not where we were yet at the end of the 20s, although there had been recovery. Then along comes World War II. Now, everybody knows about World War II in production. But the other thing World War II did was re-liquefy the household balance sheet. And now this gets a little complex, because what the federal government did was sell bonds to the banking system. And the banking system created a checking account for the government. Created it out of thin air. The government wrote checks to build the war machine. People were employed building the war machine, and that was their payroll. And so at the end of the war, not only were they fully employed, but their bank accounts had risen. They had a huge amount of liquid assets. And so we could really start over. Does everybody understand? The whole balance sheet was totally reliquefied. It's as if a ton of money had fallen down from the sky. Well, that was an unusual set of circumstances. You see, that was a quirk. It was a quirk. Well, you can't count on that happening. So what's going to happen? See? Now, that's the way I'm looking at it now. But once again, I may be entirely too, what's the right word? Entirely too gloomy here, and there may be something that I'm just not seeing and so on. But not that and I don't mean to, once again, this is repeating myself, I don't mean to say we're headed for the Great Depression, and I don't think so. I'm just saying there's something between the Great Depression and robust situation. I just think we may be in for a time when it's just like that L, it just isn't so strong. Yeah, Dave.
So there's two major assets we talk about: real estate, homes. Most of us, two kinds of assets: real estate and stock market.
Yeah.
So they didn't necessarily rise and fall together.
Correct.
Correct. But now they have something in common.
Yes.
Namely, dependency on banks.
Yes.
So that real estate markets depend on people's ability to borrow from mortgages.
Yes.
Corporations' ability to turn it around based on their ability to borrow.
Yes.
So would you say then that one leading indicator would be the health of the banks?
Yes, definitely. The health of banks has to come.
And how do we evaluate that?
Well, for instance, the government is now doing these stress tests.
Right.
And that evaluation will come out. And we'll see going forward if the stress tests are met, if the banks continue to report earnings, if they grow, all that's there. The question to me is, are people going to then borrow and spend? Now, for instance, if there was a new technology boom, great. That would, for instance, if biotech or wireless or green tech had the oomph of the PC boom, what happened in the 90s, yay, that would really work. Absolutely. But those facts are not yet in evidence. It may be that, let's take green. There's an example, green. It may be that it happens, but we don't know yet. Now, that doesn't mean it's not. I mean, in 1990, there were very few people who forecast that huge tech boom that happened. I certainly didn't see it, and I think most people didn't see it. There may have been some who saw it, and but they weren't shouting the loudest. So it could be the green will take over. So that would be wonderful, because there would be borrowers and spenders, and you were asking who's going to borrow from the banks and so on. That would be great. So there would be an example of a real boost.
And the banks could do the lending.
Exactly.
People want to borrow.
Yes, and those guys could sell stock, and people would be happy to buy it, and it would go up, and that would make everyone feel good. So it would be like the tech boom. But we have to wait and see if the green boom will be like the tech boom. I don't know. We can all hope so, for a number of reasons, one of which, of course, it would help the planet. But we'll have to wait and see. Now, the next thing that would help is if people started borrowing and spending again, in just the conventional sort of way. But
how can they borrow? The banks won't know.
But let's say the banks were willing to lend. Let's just say they recovered and they're willing to lend. Let's just say it. Well, are they going to borrow? I mean, getting back to Mike's question, well, when will the climate in real estate be such that people will be encouraged to borrow and build the way they once did? When is that going to happen? I mean, it may happen, but I don't know. For instance, and look, I mean, there's all kinds of things, problems. Like, look what happened to retail. Retail just exploded. Now, is retail going to come back the way it, wow, that's tough, isn't it? That's hard to say. Because they're all tied together, aren't they? I mean, they're all symptomatic of one another.
It's more related to CPI.
Yeah, well,
And income than assets.
I mean, the problem is the new chic is not spending. That's a problem. That is a problem. And so we'll see, I mean, it's different now. Something really changed. Something really changed in these last two booms that we see up here. Something really changed, and it remains to be seen how we get out of it, how we get out of this dilemma, problem. See? Any other questions? Okay, well, I said we quit at 5, and I don't want to talk the collection off the plate. So thank you very much for your attention. And remember, my last piece of advice, buy low, sell high. All right, thanks a lot.